Does God exist? Are science and faith enemies? Your host for this series was an atheist who became a believer in God through his studies in science. Here is public high school teacher John Clayton.
In the first two presentations of this series of videos, we took a look at a logical argument for the existence of God. And I want to emphasize in this particular presentation, it's assumed that you have looked at the first two videos. Now, if you haven't done that, it might be a good idea to go back and look at the first two programs, because otherwise you may sort of get the idea this is a God of gaps argument, that we're saying that somehow we invent a God to explain what we don't understand. And that's not the argument. You'll see that we have started out on the assumption that the viewer is willing to accept the fact that they exist, that there is reality. We then have looked at the question of, if there is reality, there are two choices about how that reality came into existence. Choice number one is that it had a beginning. Choice number two is that it did not have a beginning. And we looked at quotes from both religious and atheist sources that indicated that those two choices, in fact, pretty well summarized the approaches that might be made by both orientations. We then looked at the question of, okay, if there was a beginning, because scientific evidence supports that point, and we demonstrated the evidence in the first video, then the question is it caused or is it not caused? And we saw that suggesting that it is not caused puts you in a position of really denying all of science. So from that point, we want to move on to say, okay, if we accept the idea there was a beginning, that scientifically we believe that can be ascertained, and if we accept the logic that says that the beginning was caused, what was the cause? And I would suggest to you that there are two logical choices about that cause. Choice number one is that the cause was caused by something that's personal. That would suggest an intelligence that created the creation with purpose and with order and with logic and with design. The other alternative is that the universe is a product of chance, that everything is the result of rote mechanistic accident. Design demands a designer. Plan demands a planner. And the opposite of that is to assume that everything is the product of chance. One of the interesting quotes on this is a quote by Julian Huxley. And as you read that, I'd like to point out to you that this is a beautiful statement of the alternative to the concept that there is design and purpose and order in the creation. I've seen this statement in science textbooks. Being a high school science teacher in the public schools, I've always been kind of interested that it was there, because it really isn't a statement of science. It's really a statement of religion. As a matter of fact, Huxley has made references to that. One of his relatives made this statement based upon his ideas, and I think it's kind of interesting to notice that he readily admits that the motivation for assuming there is no meaning, no purpose, no design in the creation is a philosophical religious purpose. I think the end statement there is so obvious. The philosophy of meaninglessness was essentially an instrument of liberation, sexual and political. I think that's an accurate statement. But that really isn't the purpose of our discussion. What I'd like to do is to show you that this first statement that assumes that everything is the result of a long series of singularly beneficial accidents is not scientifically reasonable, that there is good, solid, logical evidence from science that there is purpose, that there is design, that there is intelligence in the creation. And I would like to show this to you in the next couple of programs on 4 levels. And the level we'd like to approach in this discussion is the one that's listed first on this series, on an intuitive level. Now later on we'll talk about some mathematical analysis. Later on we'll talk about some of the complexities that come that can be statistically analyzed. But in this discussion, what we're interested in is the concept that in fact there are some things that you just look at and you have to say, boy, is it really reasonable to believe that what we're looking at can possibly be the product of blind, rote, mechanistic chance. So let me show you a couple of my favorite examples that There's not going to be any heavy statistical analysis here. I'm not suggesting there aren't other alternative views that might be expressed on this, but I ask you to think about whether or not these things can really and truly be viewed logically as a product of chance. And one of my all-time favorites is the question of migration. And the best example of migration that we could give is, I think, the Arctic tern. The Arctic tern is an incredible living thing. The Arctic tern spends their summers on the north slopes of Alaska and Canada. In the fall of the year, they take off and they fly 12,000 miles to the southern edge of South America. And then the following spring, they fly 12,000 miles back. 24,000 miles. That round-trip distance is the circumference of the Earth. And the question is, what really allows them to do this? When you look at the tern, it doesn't look any different than most other living things. And as a matter of fact, what we have discovered is that many of the abilities that this little bird has are present in all living things in one form or another. And one of the first proposals that people gave of this was that maybe the tern just sees their way down there, that they move from one landmark to the other. And so they do it by sight. So they've equipped Arctic terns with contact lenses, which made them so nearsighted they couldn't see past the end of their beak. So they couldn't possibly pick up landforms and follow geographic identities to make their way from the north slopes of Alaska to the southern edge of South America. But even completely deprived of the sense of sight, the birds were able to make the journey. Another suggestion was that maybe they hear their way. You know, they listen to the wind blowing through the mountain passes. They hear waves lapping up on the shore, and so they use sound to make the journey. So they equipped terns with their own set of private headphones, essentially, which provided extraneous sounds that would drown out any noise they could possibly use. And they were still able to make the journey. Somebody else suggested, well, maybe they're smelling their way down there. And so they equipped a tern essentially with its own private gas mask. And completely given the wrong sense of odors, they were able to make the journey. Somebody else suggested that perhaps it's the Earth's magnetic field that they're following. And so they equipped Arctic terns with magnetic scramblers that would louse up their magnetic field. And they were still able to make the journey. And I'm sure most of our viewers are aware that these same kinds of experiments have been done with whales. They've been done with all kinds of other living things. And the bottom line, what comes out to us in this discussion is that apparently this process of being able to make the journey is not just one system. Apparently there's more than one system, and when one system gets loused up, they're able to use another system. Now, the question is, how did these systems come about? Because the nesting capabilities of these birds are dependent upon being able to make the journey. And it's interesting also to understand that diet is not an issue here. Somebody might say, well, they can only eat one kind of food, and the only place the food grows is up here on the north slopes and down there on the southern edge of South America. And so they have to make the journey to secure the food. But the tern is a scavenger. They're a very wide-range food source eater. They're omnivore. They can eat plant type of things. They can eat fish. They can eat corn. I mean, I've had experience with terns working at camps in Canada in which I have discovered a large number of variety of things that terns will eat. They'll steal worms out of your fishing bucket. They'll eat bird seed off the bird feeder. This isn't a bird that has a narrow kind of diet. They can only eat one kind of bird seed. But I would suggest to you there are three possible explanations about how this living thing acquires its ability. And I believe these tests could be applied to any kind of migration study of whales or of ducks or geese or eels or turtles or anything you might like to talk about. And the first of these three alternatives is that they learn this. See, the idea is that perhaps the terns are educated by their parents. And so the result is that they actually just are taken or led by their parents to make the journey, and so they just emulate what their parents have taught them. And we know there are some animals that do learn migratory types of behavior in this way. Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep, the babies seem to learn from the parents. There was an interesting experiment a number of years ago. A group of scientists from Madison, Wisconsin, went up on the North Slopes and essentially stole a nest of eggs. Actually, they took eggs from several different nests. They took them back to Madison, Wisconsin. They incubated the eggs in Madison. They hatched the eggs in Madison. They raised the baby birds in Madison. Here were a group of baby Arctic terns that had never had an opportunity to learn anything from their parents. In the fall of the year, they took one of these baby birds up on the North Slopes, and they released it on the North Slopes with a little radio transmitter so they could track its behavior and see if it knew how to make the migration. And you know what happened? That baby tern that had never had any contact with another tern flew a tight circle over the island where he had been found as an egg. He took off along the same route that his parents had flown. And less than a month later, he landed just a few feet from the rest of his bird population, actually from his parents. Now, there's no way that you can talk about him having learned this behavior. He had no opportunity to learn it. Learning is simply not the possibility. How are you going to talk about learning in the case of something like a butterfly? The monarch butterfly is an example of the same type of behavior, and you've got no brain, no learning potential involved in the animal. Learning simply does not work. Well, somebody else might respond at this point, and they might say, well, it's just a product of chance. It's just an accident. I mean, they have to go this far for survival, and so the birds that make the journey survive, and the birds that don't make the journey don't survive. But look at the pattern that the bird is taking. It isn't as though they're moving from a hazardous environment to a safe environment. The Arctic tern goes over equatorial areas. If all they're trying to do is to get away from the cold, why don't they stop in Florida like everybody else does? There's no rational reason for them to travel another 4,000 miles if all they're trying to do is to get away from the negative weather. And they end up going to another place that is very harsh and very cold. Chance doesn't seem to be a workable answer. But a skeptic looking at this might say, well, okay, you're going to throw out learning, you're going to throw out chance on that kind of a basis. You also have to throw out design. I mean, after all, why would a kind, loving, intelligent God make a poor, helpless little bird fly an extra 5 or 6 or 7 or 8,000 miles? What is it? God hates Arctic terns? He says, I'll fix you. I'll make you fly 12,000. Is there some kind of evil purpose involved in this? But you know, you're not thinking very far when you just confine the discussion to the living thing you're talking about. In our day of concern about ecology and understanding about the interdependence of living things, we now realize the Arctic tern just doesn't live to itself. The Arctic tern provides nutrients in an area where there's no other way to get nutrients. The Arctic tern is a major factor in the food chain of many animals on the North Slope and many similar animals on the southern edge of South America. It may not be to the advantage of the tern to make this journey. But if the tern didn't make the journey, large numbers of animals in two isolated, very fragile, very delicate ecosystems would be incapable of survival. There is a logical reason for the journey. And I would suggest to you that of the 3 choices that are available, learning, chance, and design, design is far and away the best possible answer to this behavior. And it's interesting, as we look at the United States and we look at the behavior of the tern, there's lots of other living things we could have used. The monarch butterfly makes a similar type of journey, moving from areas in Canada and the eastern and northern United States to Mexico. And again, the same type of discussion would have to be involved in how they make this journey and why they make this journey. The butterfly is amazing. When the wind's in their face, they fly close to the ground, taking care of aerial dynamics that are present there. When the wind's behind them, they fly high up in the air. And actually, a single adult doesn't make the total journey. There will be several offspring that will be produced in the process of a year, and the offspring follow the route that the adults were traveling. And again, you can't talk about learning. You can't talk about some kind of process where it's passed on from butterfly to butterfly. You're looking in this particular visual at the different population of monarchs and where they travel to. It's another incredible example of migratory patterns. And there are dozens of examples that could be given. As a matter of fact, most of you are aware of salmon. It's interesting to watch the incredibly strong drive that is put into salmon to be evil, trying to hurdle a dam in order to try to maintain the programmed capacity to move back to the place where that salmon was produced itself and to reproduce as a process of continuing life. And it's interesting to understand that the genetics of this process would have to be put into this animal in the same way as the other things that we have talked about. Migration. It's an incredible illustration of design and purpose in the creation around us. But there's other types of intuitive design. I want to tell you a personal story. A couple of years ago, I was invited to do a program in Florida, not too far from Orlando. And when I got down there, the people that I had been invited to stay with lived on a house out in the country. And as I pulled into the driveway of this house, there was a pond next to the house. And as I pulled in, I noticed that they had some pumps going that were pumping the pond dry. And the guy's teenage sons were out there seining the fish out of the pond. And when I got out of the car, I said to him, well, what you doing in your pond? He said, we're pumping it dry. We got to get the rough fish out of there. We got to dig it deeper. We need to get rid of the algae and so forth. So we're trying to improve it. I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. And after supper, we went down and looked at the pond, and it was pretty much dry by that time. And when we looked at the pond, the bottom of the pond was just crawling with turtles. I mean, this little 2 or 3 acre pond must have had 1,000 turtles crawling around in the mud at the bottom of it. And I asked the guy, I said, what are you going to do with all these turtles? And he said, I called the county ag agent, and he said, don't worry about them. They take care of themselves. So, in my own mind, I'm saying, well, they're going to burrow down in the mud. They're going to be protected until the water gets back in there. So I didn't think too much about it. Well, we went to the place where I was giving a presentation that night, and we got back home around midnight, and as we pulled in the guy's driveway, there was a herd of turtles. Well, what do you call a whole bunch of turtles going one direction? I call them a herd. A herd of turtles going across the guy's driveway. They were all going one direction. I had to get out of the car and move the turtles off the driveway so the guy could get into his garage. Well, the next morning we got up and went down to look at the pond, and when we got to the pond, looked over there where the turtles had gone, and there was an interstate, essentially, blasted through the yucca and the underbrush where the turtles had mashed down the vegetation, all going basically one direction. It was only in one place. So being curious, we followed the path. And when we got to the end of that path, as we walked down, we found that the path ended up at another pond. And the last of the turtles were just getting to the pond. We looked at a topographic map. It was about 1.25 miles to this next pond. But if they had gone any other direction than the way that they went, it would have been over 8 miles to the nearest body of water. Question. How did they know the pond was there? Answer. Polarized light. Little physics lesson here. You're standing on the edge of a lake with a flat rock in your hand. If you throw the rock at the water, does it matter how you throw it as to what the rock will do? Well, yeah, I'm sure that none of you had such deprived childhoods that you didn't skip rocks. You know that if you throw the rock flat or parallel to the water, what happens is that the rock will skip. And surely you've had the joy of skipping rocks. On the other hand, if you throw the rock vertically to the water or at a high angle to the water, the rock will penetrate. Now, this isn't just true of rocks. This is true of light. Light has a particular plane in which it travels. All light beams have their plane set by the way in which they were propagated. And light does the same thing rocks do. If light is directed perpendicularly into the ground, just like a rock, it is absorbed into the ground. If it's shown at somewhat of an angle, then it will refract. It will change direction, but it will still penetrate. On the other hand, if the light is thrown at a low enough angle, essentially parallel to the surface of the ground, as this visual shows, then what happens is that the light skips, just like a rock. But the only light that skips is the light that has its plane of vibration roughly parallel to the surface off of which it is reflecting. That light bouncing with its particular plane has a name. It's called polarized light. and it is always parallel to the surface off of which it reflects. You understand how your sunglasses work? See, your sunglasses have a crystal that the lens is made of that is one direction. And in the case of your sunglasses, it's vertical. Reflected light is horizontal. So if the sunglass is vertical and the light is horizontal, the light can't get through. And so your Polaroid sunglasses block the glare. That's how your Polaroids work. Do you know that turtles wear Polaroids? Well, actually, it's the cornea of the eye that has material that is made of a crystalline nature, and in the turtle, the angle is parallel to the ground. Now think about that. If the lens of the eye, or if the cornea of the eye is parallel to the ground and the turtle is scanning the horizon, and there is light reflecting from a body of water, what's the turtle going to see? Well, the light that is reflected is going to be able to get through the cornea of the eye more easily, and the turtle is going to see it brighter than light that is in other planes. And so what that means is that as the turtle looks at the horizon where the nearest body of water is, it's going to see the shaft of light coming up more brightly than the area around it. And all the turtle has to do is to head for the light. Now, once again, the question has to be, is this some kind of an accident? Is this a chance process? Or is it a designed process? And I understand that people can construct models to explain on an evolutionary basis how that type of characteristic might have developed. It is interesting that other living things, like for instance many waterfowl, have Polaroids that are this way in their eye. And what that means is that they are able essentially to see through the clouds because the reflected light off the top of the clouds is going to be horizontal, and they can therefore tell where the sun is, even on a cloudy day, which is a tremendous help in migration. Let me show you one more example of design in the creation. When you look at me, you're looking at what is called a placental mammal. On the screen right now, you're looking at a marsupial mammal, a kangaroo. Now, some of you are saying to yourself, well, I don't see much difference in those two. Well, well, we got the same shape, don't we? Anyway, the point is not the way we look. The point is, how do we come into existence? You see, when I came into this world, I had been developing for 9.5 months inside my mother. And I came into this world with all my equipment. I had my fingers, I had my toes, I had my nose, I had my eyes, I had my ears. I even had hair at that time. I was totally and completely equipped. Now, when this kangaroo came into the world, it didn't come in looking like this. As a matter of fact, when you see the cute little pictures of the Joey in the pouch, that's not a baby kangaroo. That's a teenager. As a matter of fact, it's interesting when you're around kangaroos that you learn that sometimes there's a little battle that goes on between mama and teenager kangaroo. Because the teenager wants to stay in the house and get a free meal. And the mother wants to move him out. Sound familiar? And so what you'll see sometimes is a mother hopping across with a baby wanting to get in the pouch to get a free meal. And he'll try to dive in the pouch, and if he does get into the pouch, the mother just says, that's it, and she lays down. And she'll stay there until the baby gets out. Kind of hard sometimes to get the youngsters to move out, and that's what's happening in this sequence of pictures. But I want to emphasize that these are not babies. These are teenagers. And pictures like this that show these young kangaroos are looking at adolescent kangaroos, not at baby kangaroos. Here's what a baby kangaroo looks like. That's a teaspoon. A baby kangaroo is about 1/3 or 1/4 up to 1/2 inch long. And it is brought into this world some 4 or 5 weeks after conception. You know what it has to do in that condition? It has to crawl over 25 times its body length, vertically up the stomach of a mother who is hopping around all over the place and doesn't even know he's there. He has to open the pouch. He has to crawl down inside the pouch. He has to hunt around until he finds a nipple where he hooks on and draws his nourishment for the next 6 or 7 months. Now, the mother doesn't help him. And it's kind of interesting as you look at this to realize that this is a survival issue. He has to do this all on his own. But you know what? If he doesn't make it into the pouch, if he falls off, He has a baby brother or a baby sister already conceived inside the mother, already developing, that will be born within 4 to 5 weeks if he doesn't make it into the pouch. If he does make it into the pouch and starts drawing milk from the mother, baby brother or sister will go into a state of suspended animation and will develop no further until the first baby's out of the pouch. Now, if that first baby goes 3 days and dies of a congenital deformity, at that point, baby brother or sister will resume their development. If he goes 3 weeks and dies of a disease, at that point, the second baby will resume its development. If he goes 3 months, falls out of the pouch, and gets stepped on, at that point, baby brother or sister will resume their development. If he goes 8 months and leaves on his own steam, at that point, baby brother or sister will resume their development. There is always a baby waiting in the wings. The female kangaroo is perpetually pregnant. And ladies, if that doesn't give you a nightmare, nothing will. You engineers thought that you thought up the first backup system. Here's a backup system that defies anything man's ever done. And the engineers would be the first ones to tell you that a backup system is more difficult to engineer than a primary system. But I'm still not done. There's 2 nipples inside the mother. The first nipple, the one that we have shown you already in this process, is a very small nipple. And it is low-fat milk. The second nipple is a much larger nipple, and it contains high-fat milk. 28% higher in fat content than the small nipple. When the baby comes into the pouch, he has to get the right nipple because his body cannot metabolize the high-fat content of the large nipple. No problem. The high-fat milk nipple is so large he can't get it in his mouth. He always gets the right nipple. But then how do you make him switch? There are muscles running from the bottom of the pouch to the top of the small nipple. When the baby gets big enough that his weight pushes down on the bottom of the pouch, that pulls up on the small nipple. So eventually, when the mother kangaroo takes a king-size hop, that pulls the small nipple up out of the reach of the baby, and the only nipple the baby can get is a high-fat milk nipple, the large nipple, which better meets his needs. Now the question is, are we really willing to attribute this kind of incredible complexity to the result of a long series of singularly beneficial accidents? Or are we going to recognize that there is design and there is purpose in the creation around us? Now you can go in your backyard, many of you, and see the possum, which is a very similar type of animal and lives in very much the same way. But in all these cases, this behavior can't be learned. It can't be something that is just a product of chance. I submit to you, it is an example of design. And this statement that says we are a product of blind forces is a statement that I believe is contradicted by the evidence. And science writers have repeatedly said things like this statement of Frederick Hoyle's, that we cannot just on the basis of blind mechanistic chance explain the complexities of the world that we see around us. In our next several videos, we want to show you some more examples of this type of design. And I would suggest to you that the Bible recognizes this principle. And we hope that you'll investigate and look more deeply into the evidence that there is design in the creation that demands a designer, that we are not the product of chance.
Does God Exist is an educational program which attempts to provide evidence that man can logically believe in God and that the Christian system presented in the New Testament is the best option for successful living. We offer materials free and on loan. Contact us by mail, fax, or email for a catalog, to request materials, or just to ask questions. Does God exist may be the most important question you will ever ask.